David Day, welcome to Booktopia.
Thank you.
Now, you've tackled Chifley and Curtin.
And Andrew Fisher.
And now you're tackling Paul Keating. Paul Keating is around. He's watching. What sort of difficulties do you face as a biographer dealing with someone who has proudly controlled his legacy and been watchful of all attempts to portray him in books, in media and the like, and has kept every newspaper article? Is there a trepidation, or is it a challenge or an excitement when you take on someone like Paul Keating?
Yeah, it was both a challenge and a trepidation. You know, it was a really daunting thing to do, because I was sort of like the little kid in Sixth Sense. You know, I see dead people, Curtin and Chifley. Suddenly there's a live person there, and a really protective live person. So for a while, I put off the actual writing of it, hoping against hope that he would sort of mellow with age in his attitudes and be more open to the idea of a biography, because that's the problem. Not only is he protective of his image, but he has rejected the idea of a biography being written and rejected the idea of doing his memoirs as well. So that's presented incredible difficulties, really. But at the same time, he's gone ahead and done television interviews and other things that have provided the means of writing a biography. So eventually, after some years, I got up the courage to actually start writing, and wrote it quite quickly, and now it's out there.
My worry, I get the sense that if someone's going to write a biography about Keating, there's a certain level of admiration for what he was able to achieve, and as an admirer, by doing a biography, do you risk actually losing his admiration towards you, or there's a risk of the person you admire turning around and saying nasty things about you or something? Is that a risk as someone who admires a great man?
Yeah, absolutely. And because I'm an historian, I'm not writing hagiography. I'm interested in finding what it was that drove Keating to do what he did, what were his strengths, but at the same time, what were the flaws, the other side of the coin, that caused him in 1996 to be rather ignominiously thrown out. So what did people not like about him, or what caused him to fall over politically at the end? That's
an interesting question, because when I was a young man going through the Keating years, and my impression of him deregulating the banks, floating the dollar, trying to push a consumption tax through, I was confused by him, because I didn't see him as a Labour man.
Yes.
He had the suits, he had the Italian shoes, he had the classical music and the antiques. It didn't seem to present the picture that I had in my mind of the Labour man coming through the unions and having a sort of a more working class background. So in that final period, was it that got him thrown out, or was it?
It was a whole load of things, really. It was a combination or a accumulation of all the things that he'd done that had resulted in that recession in the early 1990s, which caused a lot of hardship. And the problem is he didn't seem to relate to people who were suffering the hardship. And it took him quite a while. He talked about, of course, famously, the recession we had to have, which seemed to show no sympathy or empathy for people. And the people that I was mixing with at the time were really upset by it, because they were lost their jobs, lost their businesses, had to take children out of school. It was a really hard time for a lot of people. And yet, nevertheless, he managed to get back in 1993, and to do it, bringing up some huge issues for Australia, such as making the Republic an election issue in 1993 and winning through against all the odds. So one of the things that I got from writing this was just an incredible sense of political courage that Keating had, not only in standing up against Hawke and putting his whole political career on the line as he did, and winning through, but for a time thinking he'd lost it all. but then tackling those big issues like the Republic that other people had shrunk from doing, and like reconciliation, by bringing in a proper response to the Mabo judgment and turning to Asia, putting Asia very much front and centre of the Australian consciousness.
That, while reading the book, those kinds of issues that he was able to get through, I just got this sort of surge of admiration for this man going against the current trends of the responses that everyone wanted to have to the Mabo was just pushed aside. There was everyone, let's protect here, and they were all so frightened of it, and he was so calm. So it saw the answer seems so clearly that it wasn't something to be feared; it was something to be rejoiced and enjoyed and celebrated that we have come so far. That again, I suppose, when you then jump into the Howard years and you think, how can we possibly have flipped as a people so far? Is that just great leadership? He stretched us beyond where we wanted to go in that period.
Yeah, I mean, he had a real vision for Australia and realised that he realised that he wasn't going to be there all that long. And I think the 1993 victory was a bit of a surprise. It was sort of unexpected that John Hewson was a really formidable opponent, and yet and he was pushing a policy that Keating had formerly pushed, the GST, and yet Keating got over the line and got Labor over the line. He then felt that he only had one term. He had to make his mark in that one term. So he took on these big issues and pushed them because he felt that he wouldn't necessarily get another chance. There wasn't going to be 6 years ahead of him in which to do it. He had to do it, and he had to do it now. And he didn't shrink from it, which was great, I think.
There's an interesting point. I've suffered from dyslexia my whole life, and I've found ways around it. I've found other routes to go. And seeing Paul Keating's performances within Parliament, and when you make the connection between him faltering in reading speeches, so then developing this great skill as a result of it, how difficult was it to find information about Keating and his suffering from dyslexia?
Well, of course, he denies it. He denies that he has dyslexia, partly because I think he feels that it's a slur, whereas in my view it's the great advantage that he had. It's what set him apart. It's what allowed him to gain ascendancy over his colleagues. It allowed him to do the clear thinking. It allowed him to make connections that other people didn't quite so readily make. It allowed him to develop the big picture, and that was his characteristic. Political asset, this idea of having a big picture for Australia and of its future. That took a while. I didn't, it wasn't until really I was well into the book that I was getting more and more evidence from people, and getting evidence from Keating himself about the way he talked about his reading, and then realising that perhaps the reason why he had this habit of going to experienced men mostly, and sort of getting the experience from them directly rather than going to books.
That mentor, I was about to ask questions about mentors. It seems such an important part of his growth, and for anyone out there, a shortcut to knowledge is going to someone who has experienced it all. It's a great example to others to use that path. I mean, others can flounder around and try to use their own personal experience, but why not go to a Jack Lang and sit at his feet and listen to him? Yes.
So while Bob Carr and other people in Young Labor were absorbing all the knowledge of labour history and of economics and politics from books, Keating was going to Jack Lang every week, sometimes twice a week, and sitting there during his lunchtime, asking him questions and getting stories from Jack Lang, going back to pre-Federation days. Lang was there at speeches done by Henry Parkes. So he was able to absorb this incredible sense of labour history and of Australian history. And I thought it was incredibly important for Keating. And he did it similarly once he got into Parliament and was Shadow Minister for Minerals and Energy. He was getting information from mining chiefs, going around the country, getting it from mining chiefs. He was hanging around the Australian Financial Review office in Parliament House, talking to Max Walsh and others about economics. And later on, just before he became Prime Minister, he was going around to Manning Clark's house and talking about listening to music, but also talking about Australia and its possibilities.
One of the most exciting parts of the book is the part where Hawke and Keating are fighting it out behind the scenes, trying to work out who's going to when the handover is going to happen. It's an extraordinary period of history that you bring forth in the book, and it is the thriller part of the biography. And did you have access to Hawke about that period, or? Yes,
I had access both to Hawke and to John Howard. Both of them were very kind in talking to me. And I see it sort of almost in Shakespearean terms, the younger man coming up and toppling the older man, not his father in this case, but somebody who suddenly appeared out of the wings and taken over as leader from Bill Hayden and was now effectively blocking Keating from his destiny. And there was this incredibly frustrating period for Keating when he thought he had an implicit or explicit agreement from Hawke to step aside after 5 years, that Hawke would fight 2 elections and then hand over. So after the 87 election, Keating thought it was only a matter of time and Hawke would hand over. But of course, Hawke, once you get into power, there's not many examples, in fact I can't think of any really, of a Prime Minister willingly standing aside for somebody else. And Hawke certainly wasn't prepared to, partly because he didn't feel Keating was up to it. Keating at that time was presenting as a fairly narrow technocrat who seemed to be aloof from the Australian people. Hawke simply wanted to hold on as well and thought that he could do the job much better than Keating and still had a lot to offer the Australian people. So, for 4 years, those 4 years after the 87 election were incredibly frustrating and annoying for Keating, and eventually, of course, he pulls it on. He pulls on the challenge, even though he knows he can't win, that he doesn't have the numbers. He was always a numbers man. He could count the numbers, he could gather the numbers, and he knew he didn't have the numbers, but he still pulled it on in the hope that he would so weaken Hawke and so weaken the government by standing aside and by going onto the backbenches that the numbers who were against him would come over to his side, which they eventually did.
David Day, thank you for speaking with us.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
David Day's biography of Paul Keating is available from booktopia.com.au right now.